In his current role as mobile security analyst, Pat is part of a nationwide mobile security program that provides strategic direction and thought leadership. Please help me in giving a warm welcome, Pat Patterson.
Hi guys, good afternoon. Everybody hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, good. So as Carrie mentioned, my name's Pat Patterson. I'm part of Fishnet's mobility practice. I'm going to talk a little bit about mobile security technology, mobile management technology. Before I get started though, just by a show of hands, I'm kind of curious. I always like to do this as my version of taking a survey. By show of hands, who's carrying an iPhone today? All right, that's a pretty good number. All right, how about folks carrying an Android device today? Also a very good number. Anybody rocking a Windows phone today, Windows 8 phone? All right, awesome. We got a couple. And then anybody still carrying a BlackBerry? All right, we'll get back to you guys later. No, that's good. I do like to see a few Windows phones in. I have yet to give a presentation where I do that and don't see any BlackBerries, so there's still certainly a good user base out there. But as you guys may have seen, Gartner has already started predicting the death knell of BlackBerry, so it'll be an interesting road for that company. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about some general mobile trends. I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that enterprises face with mobility. I'm going to talk about some of the threats that we see in the wild, and we're going to go into some little bit of forensics work that we've done. So I think that there's a room full of technical people, so that's probably going to be the most interesting, hopefully the most interesting part of the talk. Talk a little bit about awareness, and then talk about some of the technologies that we use to address some of these problems. So mobility represents yet another advancing of the perimeter. VPN started it, but now the perimeter includes the back of a cab, an airplane, all sorts of different locations. And users are expecting to be able to use any device at any time to do their work. Bring your own device keeps getting redefined with every new device that comes out on the market. And really, at the end of the day, it's all about productivity. People want to use the device that they feel makes them most productive, is the most convenient for them. So this little chart here sort of outlines some of the most recent trends with what operating systems we're seeing. We're still seeing most companies are supporting Apple iOS. These numbers are from 2012, so obviously they've changed a little bit during the course of this year. BlackBerry was still pretty high up there. Obviously, from the show of hands that we saw at the top, that number has probably changed. But we're also seeing Android and Windows phones both increasing in their presence in corporations. Talk a little bit about Android. Android is probably the most interesting space within mobile security just because of the variety. If you take the number of versions of Android, multiply that by the number of handset manufacturers and handsets that they make running Android, multiply that by the number of carriers that add their own nuances to the devices and sell them, you get a really wide variety of what you might see on a given user's device on a given day. Some of the things that are interesting about Android from a security perspective, Google didn't really get, in our opinion, serious about security until version 4.0. That's when they introduced APIs to make sure that devices were encrypted. That's when they introduced a number of other coding type things that allowed the devices to be more secure. From an organization perspective, what this means is that you guys ideally would only want to support Android devices that are running 4.0 and above. The problem with that lies in the little pie chart that you can see, and I'll read you the numbers because I'm sure they're impossible to read out there. The darker portions of the pie are 4.0, 4.1, 4.2, 4.3. The lighter part of the pie, which is still a full third of the devices out in the field, are running 2.2 and 2.3. Which means if you have a bring your own device policy at your organization, there's going to be some folks showing up with a Pantech running 2.2 wanting to get corporate email on it, and you're going to have to decide from a policy perspective if that's okay with you, and then from a technology perspective, if it is okay, what technology measures are you going to put into place to mitigate the risk that operating system introduces. Quick update about Jelly Bean 4.2.2 and 4.3. I mentioned the ASLR, the address space layout randomization. That's one of the coding things that they did in the background to make Android more secure. What that really comes down to is prior to 4.0, Android, when it would boot, would always lay out its libraries in the same place in memory on every device. So if I knew about a vulnerability in an Android library, I knew exactly what memory location to go after to exploit it, which would be, make it a lot easier to do a buffer overflow, et cetera. So with 4.0 and continuing on in the 4.0 chain, they added the ASLR, the address space layout randomization. Some additional features that they added: app encryption, which they were used to be the apps would come down from the Play Store in the clear. Now they're encrypting them. The Smart App Update, which is kind of a handy thing if you're on a data plan. You only want to update the deltas of the applications rather than the entire app. Fast user switching is sort of an interesting thing from a management perspective that they added in 4.3. The idea was if you've got a family tablet or if you've got a tablet that's used by multiple clerks in a given store, they can each have their own personal profile and switch between them. From a management perspective, though, the way that they implemented the API means that all of the management is done under the very first person that uses the tablet. So it gets very dicey for organizations that are trying to use that to actually manage it adequately. Talk a little bit about Samsung Knox, and this I think, from my perspective, is one of the most important advances that the Android space has seen since the 4.0 release. And the reason is that BlackBerry conundrum that we were talking about earlier. Samsung, with their Knox product, has attempted to make their Knox-enabled devices unrootable. They're using PKI between the hardware and the Linux SE kernel on the device to try to make it impossible for someone to root their device without it being detected by the corporate management. It makes it really unsuitable for a BYOD environment. I wouldn't recommend that you have your users put Knox on their devices because the management becomes very difficult to take off. You can't de-Knox it. But for those of you that are still holding on to BlackBerries because they are the most secure platform, there's no rooting, everything is very well locked down, it might be something worth looking into once Knox has become generally available to replace those BlackBerries that you're holding on for very secure environments. I mentioned rooting. I think probably pretty much everybody in here knows what rooting an Android device means, but just in case you don't, I actually asked one time when I gave this talk, does anybody not know what it is? And nobody's hand went up, like they didn't want to admit that you don't know? Okay, so rooting an Android device is when you take an Android device, you run a piece of software on it that removes Google's security restrictions, so that you can get at the root file system. You can remove those AT&T apps that AT&T won't let you remove, so that you can tether to your PC to your phone when AT&T doesn't let you unless you buy their plan, and so on. So it's basically taking the shackles off of, the security shackles off of the device. At the same time, you open yourself up to having malware or unwanted software do the same thing. So rooting a device, even though a lot of people do it from a hobbyist perspective or because they have an objective on their device, it's also the very first thing that malware looks for on an Android platform in order to do its work. So I've got a couple of roots listed on the slide there, and as Carrie mentioned, the slides will be available, so I'm not going to walk through them and read you the slide. So for you Apple users, iOS 7 just came out. Has everybody upgraded to iOS 7? Anybody still on a previous iOS version other than 7? Very clever. I can't bypass your lock screen then, can I? iOS 7 has a number of security and usability updates on top of looking way different than the previous versions. One of the major features, especially with specifically with the iPhone 4S, is the Fingerprint Reader, and I'll talk about a few minutes about our opinion on that Fingerprint Reader and the security around it when we start talking about passcodes. But the Fingerprint Reader is going to be a very interesting shift in how we secure these devices. Airdrop is something new that is allowing people to share files between devices a lot more easily. Sort of it's Apple's answer to the Samsung commercial where they put their phones back to back against each other and transferred songs. But obviously, if that file that they're transferring is a corporate document rather than a song, then the corporate security folks are going to want to have something to say about that. Additionally, from a security perspective, I mentioned Touch ID. Data protection for third-party applications. So traditionally, iOS devices have had data protection at the device level. They're encrypting the storage on the device, but not at the file level. With 7.0, Apple has opened the API up so individual applications can do file-level encryption of their own application in addition to the device-level encryption. Activation locks, something that companies that are buying iPhones for their associates need to be aware of. That is an anti-theft measure at heart, but what it means is that if a user has registered a device with Apple under their personal Apple ID and turned on Find My iPhone, If you take that device back from them, it's useless. You have to get them to release that device back to you because that device is permanently tied to their Apple ID. So another thing to be mindful of if you're buying iPhones for your associates, watch out for activation lock. Managed open-in is another big step where applications can take the open-in functionality, either in email or in the application itself, and control where a particular document can be opened in. So, for example, a managed Word client can control all of the Word documents such that they can't be opened in Dropbox, for example. And then per app VPN, this is huge. I think that there's probably a lot of networking folks in here that are going to be happy that mobile devices will not have to pin up a full SSL VPN, a full layer 3 VPN to get at things anymore. Individual applications can do an app-by-app VPN from the device to the VPN concentrator, making it so that just that one app is talking on your network, not the whole device. And then some additions to iCloud are photo sharing and the keychain. The keychain's kind of an interesting thing as well, where copies of credentials, digital certificates, and passwords are now going to be stored in the cloud by Apple, should you decide to allow that on your corporate devices. Just like Android has rooting, Apple has jailbreaking. It's effectively the same thing, running software to turn off the security controls. Here's a couple of jailbreaks. And when we talk about malware, jailbreaking is the first step to getting malware on your device. So enterprise challenges. Trying to figure out what your company wants to do with these mobile devices is always challenging, just because there are people with ideas that don't come to IT with those ideas. Instead, they run out and get iPads and put those ideas into motion regardless of the security implications. So getting your organization's heads around all of the things that you want to do with these things so that you can manage them appropriately is probably the hugest, the hugest corporate challenge that most companies face. The second one, as I mentioned before, is trying to figure out what devices do you want to support? What operating systems do you want to support? Do you want to support Windows Phone devices? Beyond that, policies, especially a lot of companies overlook privacy policies. That's where the HR concerns come in. But all of these devices have GPSs and location tracking in them. Does your privacy policy cover what you're doing with that GPS information if you're collecting it at all? It really should. I'm not going to read the enterprise challenges slide to you. It's long and boring. So the question becomes, what are other organizations doing? So we're seeing companies that are doing fully corporate devices, corporate-owned devices. We're seeing companies that are doing full BYOD. But most of the companies that we're seeing are doing a hybrid, where they will, say, buy devices for their sales force because they use them all the time. But if you work on the help desk and want to get email on your phone, you can use your own device for that. So it really does come down to what's the best fit for the organization, and it could be on a department-by-department level. Why are companies doing BYOD? Well, cost is an often cited driver, but the biggest one is the second bullet there, executive adoption. New gadget comes out, executive shows up with gadget, hands it to IT or security person and says, I want to do work on this, make it work securely. I see some nodding. That's happened to, I think, all of us. The last piece of that, data in the cloud, is something that everybody should be mindful of. All of these devices are very, very cloud friendly. They're always connected and they're always wanting to push data to the cloud. So from a data protection perspective, companies have to decide how comfortable they are with that, what data can go to the cloud, what data they don't want in the cloud, and try to involve that both in their policy as well as their technology solutions. So mobile risks and threats. This is the fun part. Hopefully I haven't put everybody to sleep yet. Loss and theft. Obviously, leaving your phone in the back of a cab is a bad thing. Backups is a concern. One of the things that we recommend right away to all companies that talk to us about mobility is enforce encrypted backups. If I can buy your used PC off of eBay and it's got your iTunes backup that is created every time you've plugged in your iPhone to sync your music, and that backup's not encrypted, I might as well have your device and have it jailbroken. What we're going to see in a few minutes is actually some of the data we got out of some of those backups in addition to jailbroken devices. Just a quick note about OWASP Top 10 for those of you that are writing mobile applications. One of the things that we're seeing as we do application assessments in the mobile space is that while a lot of our developers have gotten the message about securely developing .NET applications or Java applications for PC use, we're still seeing that about 90% of the code we come across in our code reviews fails to address all top 10 of the OWASP top 10 mobile risks. So there's still some work to be done educating developers in the mobile space. My boss, Greg Martin, who you guys may have thought was coming here today, sorry, it's me. He did a little bit of a survey in Las Vegas. I don't know how long he was out there. It must have been a while. They estimate they had 5,000 cabs out there. And the cabbies that he talked to, they roughly find 2 phones a week in the back of their cab. That's about 10,000 phones per week in Las Vegas alone. Similar study was done by our UK folks. Got a similar average number from the folks in London, about 10,000 phones per week found in the backs of cabs. The Lookout mobile security folks say that an average of 113 phones are lost every minute. And the street price of those phones is about $50 a device, which $50 a device is a great price to get for an iPhone S in working order. It's an awesome price if you can then take the address book from that iPhone S and sell it to a company that's going to send spam or use that data in a nefarious way. I have heard, I can't validate this personally, but I have heard stories that there is an underground ecosystem in New York City among the cabbies where they know what corner to take those devices to get that $50. And so, you know, if you're thinking, oh, if I leave it in the cab, I might be able to call and find it. No, it's probably been sold before you make the phone call, especially since you don't have your phone anymore. So we'll talk a little bit about backups and some of the things that our forensics guys pulled off of unencrypted backups of, we're going to start with iOS devices. The first one is a little file called Voicemail Db. We were able to uncover a log, the database that records all voicemails, including deleted ones, to, from, time, length, and then, I don't know if you can see in the background, but the actual files that contain the content of those could be played as well. Similarly, the address book was available, including corporate contacts. So this is all on a stock iOS device, not jailbroken, but a backup that wasn't encrypted. The point of these couple of slides, though, is to show that, number one, beyond the device-level data protection, Apple's not doing a lot to protect that content. So if you can get a hold of that backup, or if you can jailbreak the device, you can get at this raw data, including deleted stuff. Similarly, calendar entries, including the subject, the notes fields, etc., were all available. My favorite, SMS Db. We all know that no personal or corporate contact is ever sent by text message, but this database contains every text message, including deleted ones, since the beginning of the device, unless they've been overwritten due to space concerns. Safari, when you swap away from Safari by hitting the home button on an iOS device, it saves its state in a plist file that is readily readable, so you can pull up what pages were open when that device was backed up. We actually did an experiment, and it was on a previous version of iOS. I think this hole's been closed, but we did an experiment where we took one person's iPhone who was logged into their Gmail account, didn't save the password, they just happened to be logged into it, backed it up, restored it to a different piece of hardware, and that authentication session was still valid, and we were able to use the new device and access their Gmail without having to log in again. The history is available in a plist file for the taking as well. Third-party applications are no better. What we're looking at here is a copy of a Google Drive document that has been stored locally on the file system of the application. So even though the user thought they were uploading that document to Google Drive, a copy of it sitting on the device, unencrypted, ready to be picked up and used. And if the device is jailbroken, all bets are off. You can get into the keychain, which contains email passwords, Wi-Fi passwords. Oop, that slide did not work. Okay, you're going to have to trust me that that was Wi-Fi passwords that just blew by there, as well as digital certificates. If the device is jailbroken, the standard email client doesn't offer any additional protections, so the corporate email account, as you can see on the screen, can be absolutely taken by the attacker, and all of the content, including attachments, can be used. And then finally, what we lovingly refer to as the built-in iPhone keylogger. This is the dynamic text file. So if you know the iOS sort of learns the words you type commonly, this is a flat file that those words are kept in, which can be kind of intriguing if you read through it. But one thing that we found when we did this, we did it to one of our team members' phones, and he picked out one word right away and said, "Hey, that's a password." What was happening was there was a website that did not mark the password field as password, so the device was dutifully remembering what he was typing there in the dynamic text file. And then finally, once the device is jailbroken, you can get at Safari's cache. So most of the hands that went up were about Android, so I suppose a lot of you are wondering if Android is any better. The answer is not. Actually, by default, the accounts list that you access in the accounts menu option does not encrypt either user information or password. So if you can root the device, you can get it unencrypted passwords for all of these accounts. Similarly for Wi-Fi, that's just a flat text file. This is the default Gmail client, but it's also the basis for most of the other email clients out there. This would obviously exclude the Samsung Safes and the HTCs and the Motorola's and LGs of the world that actually have a serious corporate email client on their devices. So what would be the right approach? Obviously, we want to use the keychain wherever possible on iOS devices and the Android protected store. And we want to be able to use SQLite or SQL encryption for those cases where we have to store secure data in or sensitive data in a database. And then finally, we want to make sure that we are monitoring for jailbroken and rooted devices. So in addition to all of that fun stuff, all of the security concerns that apply to desktops and laptops apply equally to mobiles. In fact, I saw a study where users are 3 times more likely to click on an email link on their mobile device than they are on their PCs. So much like the developers that aren't getting the OS top 10, users aren't getting don't click on the darn links. I don't know if they think the devices are impervious to attack or I don't know what the deal is, but all of these awareness type things that you're seeing here on this slide, very much alive and well in the mobile world. So I promised we were going to talk about iOS passcodes, or passcodes in general, and I've got the slide about iOS that is a result of some of our forensics testing. They took an iPhone 4 and put it into DFU mode to bypass that whole 10 strikes and you're out type thing, and used a computer to figure out how long it would take to brute force different length passcodes. So you can see that a simple passcode can be brute forced by a computer in less than 30 minutes. These are all upper bounds. So it could be, you could get it right on the first try, obviously, but you can try all combinations in less than 30 minutes. 6 numeric digit, that goes up to 3.15 days, which is a little bit more palatable if you're running a security department where you want to be able to wipe the phone before it gets hacked. The 3.15 days sounds a lot better than trying to expect the user to call in and that remote wipe command to be effective in 30 minutes. And then complex passcode, we have had 1 or 2 clients try this. 7 alphanumeric and at least 1 upper and 1 special character. Definitely a lot longer to run through all of the possible combinations, but there is some thought that they may be over secure. So now my own personal opinion on Touch ID. It's brand new. It didn't even make it into the slide deck. From my perspective, depending on where you land on your passcode chart, Touch ID can be as secure, possibly even more secure than what you're doing with passcodes. I would say Touch ID is probably more secure than a 4-digit passcode. Apple did a couple of clever things with Touch ID that make me a little bit more comfortable with it. First of all, they have a 5 strikes and you're out limit. So if you try that Touch ID with a fingerprint 5 times, after that 5th failure, it forces you to use the passcode. It falls back to the passcode that you've got on the device. So if you can't use the crazy glue trick in the first 5 tries, then you're back to having to hack the passcode on it. iOS also requires that passcode to be entered every 6 hours, I think it is. So if the fingerprint thing is just more convenient for that 6 hours, and then at the end you're falling back to the passcodes. So as long as you've got a strong passcode, Apple has put measures into place that, at least from my perspective as a security professional, make me feel more comfortable letting that Touch ID exist. Now, none of the management of those Touch ID functionality has entered the marketplace in the MDM manufacturers. I do know that Apple published an API, but basically that API only allows you to disable Touch ID. You can't control anything about the crossover error rate. You can't change that 5 strikes and you're out. It's either on or it's off from a management perspective. So, we security professionals are back in the position of being the bad guy if we decide that we're going to turn it off. So a strong passcode and getting comfortable with that 5 strikes and you're out may be the first foray you want to do before you turn it off entirely. Of course, if your organization has the complex passcode, you've probably got some sensitive data. You're not going to want Touch ID. So it's a risk decision, I guess, at the end of the day. Talk a little bit about malware. I can't stress this enough. You know, I've jailbroken and rooted phones, and it's fun, and it's cool, and there's reasons to do it. But it is also the best way to get malware. All of the malware you see on your screen here is focused on jailbroken and rooted devices. I like to talk about iKey because it's kind of funny. It usually gets a laugh. A guy in Australia, back in the early days of jailbreaking iOS devices, a guy in Australia wrote a program that scanned carrier IP address space looking for SSH shells, because everybody would jailbreak their device and then turn on SSH so they can SSH into it and get at the file system, do useful things without having to type on the keyboard. Well, a lot of these folks weren't smart enough to change the default root password on their device. Does anybody know what the default root password is on an iOS device? This is where everybody that jailbreaks their device raises their hand. Okay, it's Alpine, and it's still Alpine to this day. So what this guy did is he's scanning carrier IP address space. He finds a SSH shell, which, you know, if it's AT&T's IP addresses, it's quite likely a phone. Gets an SSH prompt, logs in his root, password is Alpine. If he gets into the device, he has now owned that iPhone. And what he did was he replaced the wallpaper on the device with a picture of Rick Astley. So he was remotely Rick-rolling people who weren't smart enough to change the default root password on their phones. Now, the guy there's a Dutch guy that wrote iPhone.a. He thought that this was a pretty clever trick. So he used the same exploit, if you will, and I put exploit in quotes because really the exploit is users that aren't very smart enough to jailbreak, but not very security savvy. He would, instead of rickrolling them, he would set an arbitrary passcode on their device and then pop up a message over the top that said, your device has been owned. If you want to unlock your device, send €5 to this PayPal account. So he was remotely extorting people to get into their phones, and he has been caught. I think he's in home confinement. Last note on this slide, I want to talk a little bit about Zipmo. I'm sure there's some folks in financial services in the audience that are familiar with the Zeus Trojan, or folks that follow security at all are familiar with the Zeus Trojan. There is a version, Zeus in the mobile, that is present on both within the BlackBerry browser as well as within rooted Android devices. So something to be aware of, that Zeus is on the handhelds as well. So from an awareness perspective, we've got this little slide that we like to talk about all of the free apps out there. You can see that the majority of the apps on the major app stores are all free. What that means is that hopefully when you download an app, you're going to get bombarded with ads for Candy Crush Saga or Pet Rescue Saga or whatever. You're going to get bombarded with begging to upgrade to the $1.99 version, or you're going to get some indication of how the application author is monetizing their investment in time in creating that application. If you don't, please be wary of that application. Even the flashlight applications now are popping up ads, and all they do is make the screen white. So I think it's important for people to be aware that there's no such thing as a free lunch. If you've downloaded a free app and it's not bugging you about some way of monetizing it, then it may be doing something in the background, like looking at your contacts, sending out spam through your connection, and so on. So this is a little game that we like to play. Android users will know that when you install an application on an Android device, it pops up a list of all of the rights that the application wants to have on your phone. So I'm going to put up the rights of a particular application that gets installed on a number of Android devices, and you guys guess what the application is. Shout it out. I should be able to hear you up here. So this particular application wants to be able to access your storage, wants to be able to look at other applications that are running, wants to be able to control the microphone, wants access to location services, wants access to your camera. It wants to take a look at what other applications are installed on your device, wants to look at your accounts, wants to be able to see your Yahoo account, your Google account, etc. Wants to be able to control whether or not your speaker's on. It wants to be able to control how often you're synchronizing. I mean, you can read these as well as I can. Wants to be able to have full and unfettered access to your network connections. Anybody want to guess? It's not Skype. It is Facebook. That's correct. So 2 takeaways from this little exercise. Number 1, some of these applications want crazy permissions on these devices. Now, when I look at this list and I compare it with what the Facebook app, I can see why. I mean, I want to be able to check in on Facebook, well, it's got to be able to look at my GPS. I want to post a picture to Facebook, it's going to need access to my camera. But it's a trade-off of functionality versus making our users numb to the fact that they're giving all of these rights to all of these applications. The second takeaway is to keep in mind that once you've granted access to Facebook, for example, to all of these rights, all of the things that run inside Facebook inherit those rights. So Mafia Wars has access to your camera. And you know, I know Facebook has been completely devoid of malware so far. This is where you all chuckle. But this kind of thing makes me nervous because we're making our users numb to it and they're basically giving away the farm every time they install an application. So talk a little bit about, you know, hopefully everybody's interested in trying to fix all of this stuff now because we're all security folks here. Talk a little bit about some of the solutions that we're seeing out in the marketplace. And this is how Fishnet breaks them down. It's not necessarily Gartner's answer. It's not necessarily Forrester's answer. But this is how we look at things. And a number of the products that are out there support multiple tiers of this pyramid here. So the very base of that triangle is mobile device management. I'm going to skip the container and go to the mobile device management piece. I'll come back to the container in a second. That is the ability to manage settings on the device, enforcing that passcode, making sure the device is encrypted, setting the screen timeout lock, those types of things. MDM was the MDM 1.0 was the original foray into this space, and we've got a number of vendors actually out in the pavilion that have been in that space for years and have grown through it. We're seeing that actually being employed in a lot of organizations in all verticals, but you can see a few of the verticals on there. But we are seeing some financials that employ the MDM approach and forego the container approach. On top of that, people are employing, and the solutions are adopting mobile application management. So this is the ability to go beyond controlling the device and being able to control how an application behaves. Enforcing authentication on the device, or on the application, so that in addition to unlocking you with your PIN code, you have to type in your AD password to get into this particular app. Being able to control the encryption on that application. So as we saw earlier, there's no file level encryption on the device unless you add it through a third party, and so that's where mobile application management comes in. They're also doing neat things with, for example, geolocation. So we have one client that is in the warehousing and logistics, and they had iPad minis that they were distributing out to the warehouses to be tracking inventory. Well, we enabled geolocation on those devices, so if that iPad mini ever walks off of that Wi-Fi network, all of the corporate data gets automatically wiped. So we're able to actually do nifty things like that with the mobile application management and geolocation. And then finally, building on top of that is mobile content management. And this means a number of different things, but at its heart, it's the ability to take corporate data, corporate content, and especially unstructured data like Word documents and spreadsheets and things like that, be able to both control what happens with those on the mobile devices as well as enable their use in a mobile environment. So a lot of the solutions out there will allow you to proactively publish SharePoint file share content repositories to mobile devices so the users just have them there. They don't have to copy them to Dropbox anymore. They don't have to do anything. That content is there on the device, which the users love. And then security loves it because we can then control where that content can be copied into, opened in, saved to iCloud, et cetera. We have more control because of that application. Similarly, we can authenticate, we can encrypt, and do all of those things that we were doing with MAM. So let me circle back around to a few slides ago and talk about the container. The container is an approach where you have an application on the device and all the corporate stuff is within that one application. So you don't really care about anything else that goes on the device. You hit that application, you type in your corporate passcode, PIN, password, whatever the requirements are, and in there you get access to your calendar, your contacts, your email, the ability to browse the internal corporate intranet, access to those SharePoints and file shares that we were talking about. It's all within a single application. It's authenticated at once. It's encrypted on disk, et cetera. It is a trade-off between making it very clear what's corporate and what's personal and being able to maintain the native look and feel on the device. So taking a containerized approach may be something that's right for a particular corporation, a particular corporate culture. Other companies may say, oh, you know what, we want to maintain that look and feel, so we'll go with the MDM, MAM, MCM combination. And I mentioned Greg Martin's name earlier. He couldn't be with us today. This is his slide. I'm not sure I really understand it. But it'll be in the deck if you can figure it out and send me an email when you know what it's trying to say. So finally, just a real quick blurb about FishNet, what we do, what we're about, and then I think we'll have a couple minutes left for questions. We do have full life cycle security offerings around mobile security. We can help with, we have a mobile workshop that helps customers get their mobility program off the ground. We like to consider it a 2-day crash strategy session. We have a very large lab presence where proof of concepts can take place if you don't have time, expertise, hardware, et cetera, to do proof of concepts. We can do application assessments. I talked a little bit about our code reviews earlier. We do mobile application assessments in addition to .NET and Java application assessments. We can certainly help with security awareness training, both mobile and general. And then we do have a forensics group that can help out when something bad happens. So I'm not going to go through all of those different pieces. I'm going to say thank you very much. I think Carrie may have the roving microphone if anybody had any questions or comments. Just raise your hand and he'll...
Who has the first question for Mr. Paterson?
Nobody? I was really that clear and thorough. Somehow
there we go. We got one.
Oh, awesome. Yes, hi.
Hi. You didn't talk anything much about the Windows Phone. I kind of believe it's more secure because of the sandbox theory. Am I disillusioned?
No, you're not. And actually, I'm glad you mentioned that because that is one of the things that we've had trouble with. There are no publicly known exploits to get at the root of Windows phones yet. So I've been harassing our forensics guys to give me some of those slides that you saw earlier from Windows Phone, and so far they're like, I can't. Sometimes I make a wisecrack when I'm up here to say, well, that's because there's no applications developed for it yet. But regardless of that, you're right. I mean, so how much of it is the lack of number of people trying to crack it, and how much of it is Microsoft baking in security into the platform remains to be seen. But so far, I certainly can't argue with your assessment.
Pat, is it safe to assume, will you be at the FishNet booth if anyone has any additional questions or wants to continue the conversation?
I will be at the FishNet booth both days, as well as I will be on the mobility panel tomorrow afternoon if you want to try to get me in front of everybody.
Okay, fantastic. Let's hear it for Pat Paterson. Thank you very much. Absolutely appreciate the information. A couple things to pay attention to now. Of course, FishNet, our presenting sponsor, does have the after party tonight. You should have received an invitation for the Slippery Noodle, which will be right after the movie. We are premiering Code 2600, the movie, this afternoon. And